Hi there. So today we're going to talk about the information security model and its different properties and how we can take our issues that we have within an organization and place them into this model to help us understand how to come up with solutions to combat vulnerabilities by putting in technical controls and maybe even some policies. So again, we're going to talk about the basic InfoSec model, also the relationship between the different elements, and how to do some classification here as well. So keep in mind that every organization is going to have some sort of vulnerability, and it's likely to be exploited. Some of them have a higher likelihood than others, for sure. In order to do this properly, you really need a team of folks to be able to examine all aspects of the company and identify all those vulnerabilities so that you have an inventory of them. If we take a look at a basic InfoSec model, you can see the red ring representing security controls that are in place, vulnerabilities that exist between either the information assets or IT systems. Some of those threats are blocked, some of them get through, right? And again, I've always said that it's not a matter of if there's a breach or a threat that makes it inside, but it's a matter of when and building those proper controls to put in place. So the basic InfoSec model has 4 different components. It's made up of assets, vulnerabilities, threats, and controls. All these activities are going to fall into one of these particular components. If we dig into assets, most of us probably think of these as being physical assets, and certainly those exist, but the most valuable for an organization are the information assets themselves. But it's really just any resource or set of information that needs to be protected. If we think about traditional security against physical assets, we think about homes, cars, equipment, devices. We don't want our phones or our tablets stolen. And we can usually easily tell when something's been broken into, right? Or it's been compromised, right? Windows have been broken, there's been shattered glass. You see a door that's been broken into, etc. In order for this to work, your intruder has to be geographically situated to have physical access to whatever that physical asset is, right? You're not going to have someone physically in California breaking into a car in Illinois and breaking the glass, right? That just doesn't happen. So when we move that to a digital space, geography doesn't really matter anymore as long as the device is connected to the internet, right? So valuable assets, customer information, financials, patent information, scientific formulas, those types of things. Most of these intrusions are in fact invisible, right? Viruses coming through email, people stealing data that's traveling across the network. There aren't quite the tracks that are left when an information asset is compromised. The other issue with information assets is, when you steal documents digitally, the digital documents are still there on the server. Someone has really just made a copy of them and taken them, right? When you steal something from a car, you don't make a copy of the iPhone and then all of a sudden leave the iPhone and take a new one with you, right? It actually disappears. Where digital assets typically end up being copied, and then that's still deemed as being stolen, but then that data can be sold or used, right? So this is kind of a general challenge, is the fact that information assets have the property of being duplicated, or that there's duplicability involved. So we've got some differences here. Consequences, when you're talking about a physical asset, you can have physical deterrents like locks, cameras, lights, sirens, sounds, all of those things to deter. But the asset recovery is much different if your car is stolen, right? You can get the car back, but with duplicability being an issue, right? And someone's copied all of your data, recovering it doesn't mean anything because it could have been copied hundreds of times with hardly any cost, right? If we take a look at assets again, and we think about it in like economic value, gold being an example, right? I've always said that information assets, other than the employees at an organization, are probably the most valuable asset in an organization. So gold, cash, all those things don't mean anything if you don't have your data, because that's what's processing everything in your organization today. So definition of vulnerabilities are any type of weakness in a system that can be exploited. Those could be technical vulnerabilities. Those could be just system weaknesses or human vulnerabilities, like we've talked about through the process of social engineering. So a couple different ways in which these vulnerabilities from a technical perspective are being tracked are through the common vulnerabilities and exposures. That is a nonprofit organization that's maintained by MITRE that provides common names and identifiers. So we have a common nomenclature for software vulnerabilities that exist. And then those are also tied to the National Vulnerabilities Database, which is a kind of more of an industry government collaboration that allows us to go out and search for specific vulnerabilities. So I could go and search for current vulnerabilities in Zoom software, and I can see, let's see, so here's one related back from January that's marked severity of critical and high, depending on which version you're using of their categorization. And this says that unauthorized root shell access through Android, arbitrary code execution, and provides a covert ability to capture screen data on the Zoom client on Windows by executing commands on the Android OS. So you're going to get a vague description here of this. You're also going to see it linked potentially to some other weakness that's been cited as well. You'll see if it's been resolved as well in the details. You can also see an analysis description. Potentially, you could go and then do additional research on Google to see how this might actually be exploited. You're going to probably find difficulty in obtaining something very specific because companies aren't going to want that kind of step-by-step guide being leaked at all for obvious reasons. So the way in which it can be exploited is usually very, very vague. It's not like, oh, here, go download the code, unless you're able to go out and find some sort of reference out that on, the dark web or some underground sites. And I kind of showed you an example of what the newer site looks like. This is just an older screenshot. Typically, these are reported by the vendor, so they know about it. You can also have them being posted by individuals or users themselves. So that can happen as well, and especially some responsible folks who are really digging deep into software, identifying it, will write it up and then send it to the CVE and the NVD. These are some statistics I grabbed just as of March of this year. So year to date, you can see new CVEs that have been received. This was taken last week, and so they had 80 just that day, 80 in that week, 984 in a month, and you can see year to date 4,048. So it's not like these things trickle in; they come in pretty widespread. I think this graph is very telling in terms of what's happened over time. You can see the last 3 years, and now it's probably going to be the 4th year where the vulnerabilities continue to skyrocket, especially here between 2016 and 2017. We start to see a large jump in vulnerabilities that are being reported. Severity over time, a lot of these fall in the medium category, but there's still a large proportion of those being high vulnerabilities in terms of how severe they are and their impact if they're exploited. This graph's a little bit older. It only goes up through 2018, but shows you the different types of vulnerabilities that have been recorded, whether it's SQL injection or whether it's some sort of OS command injection, numeric errors, buffer overflows, data handling. They haven't handled the text box properly, so you can type in anything and potentially inject code. So this kind of gives you a quick scope of the types of vulnerabilities that are showing up out there. When we talk about threats, so the definition here is capabilities, intentions, and attack methods. So when you think about threats, it's really what are the attack methods that your bad actors are going to use to exploit or cause harm to information itself. So someone trying to steal passwords, guess passwords, brute force passwords, steal intellectual property, those types of things are the actual threat. So we tie this to, right, the threat itself has both the asset included and what that individual is trying to do to that asset. These started out as pranks back in the 80s. Not a whole lot was connected to the internet in the 80s. In the 2000s, these are mostly just disruptive, like denial of service attacks, trying to prove a point that there were issues or there were vulnerabilities. And now we can see that over the last 10 years, these are mostly profit seeking by folks. A lot of information security companies do kind of attack maps to see the scope of that website changed. We will look at the Atlas intelligence feed, and some of these sites actually have I've shown several of these in class before. This one's through FireEye, a leading cybersecurity firm. And some of these sites will actually show you real-time cyber threat maps that are taking place around the world. So this kind of gives you a quick sense of where they're coming from. They've got network tools to be able to detect these. There's some older tools like that Norse Corp I tried to get to. They used to actually you could see down at the bottom whether they were DOS attacks or brute force password attempts, and they were getting categorized in real time. So you will see large security threat companies doing kind of global monitoring where those threats are coming from, where they're going, and by what means. So they're using several network monitoring tools to determine where those are coming from. So the controls are the safeguards that we're using to try to minimize the impact of those threats, right? So controls are going to help mitigate the risk of a vulnerability against an asset. So again, understand the relationship between all four of these, right? So typical controls to put in place might be technical, they might be non-technical, right? So a non-technical control might actually be the password policy. The technical control might actually be the implementation of that on the system itself. There isn't just one way to think about information security. There are several different research projects out there that define these a little bit differently. And I just want to walk through a few of those for you real quick. One of the ways of looking at this is like a pyramid. So the things that are most obvious are level one, like physical, environmental security, doors, locks, cameras, all of those things. Thinking about front-end system security, like passwords. And you can see that down the left, you can see that the visibility increases. So it's very highly visible at level one, the things that are obvious that we mostly see as consumers, but they're not all that sophisticated, right? And as we move up to level five, these things are not visible to the common end user or to bad actors. So they're trying to be obfuscated as much as possible, but they're also way more sophisticated as well in terms. So again, we're kind of back to that layered onion approach, that those inner rings are more sophisticated than those outer rings that are mostly used as deterrents. This looks at this model looks at it more as a phase, in different phases over time. So if we take a look at you're kind of in this blissful ignorance phase, not real mature, you're doing a few things, not a lot. You become very aware of the security issues. You start to develop new policies. You start to be in a corrective phase, where you're able to respond quicker and have incident response plans in place. And then you're kind of more at this operation excellence. This is more of a maturity model than necessarily a response model. This one takes the CIA triad and then overlays it in a Rubik's Cube type of pivot table model that looks at three different areas of processing data, storing data, and transmitting data, right? So what data is being stored at rest, what's being transmitted over networks, what's actually being processed, and then thinking about the policies involved with those, the tech involved with those, and the education, training, and awareness. So this is a simple model where you can look at each one of these cubes based on the CIA triad, what's happening to the data, and then the different controls across the bottom between policies, tech, and education, training, and awareness. And this model is a circular kind of model where you're in a cycle where you're constantly assessing risk. You are defining functional requirements and estimating risk reduction, costs, selecting maybe a strategy, going through an implementation process, and then measuring the effectiveness. So this one looks more like a system development lifecycle type of model to follow. Some controls can be simple and very effective. One of my favorite quotes is actually from the FireEye CEO, who said that, companies have to be right every single day. A hacker just has to be right once. So it definitely underscores the importance of having as many controls in as possible without hampering productivity from your staff. So a lot of these vulnerabilities themselves get classified, right? Some of them are specific vulnerabilities in software, whether they're operating systems or applications like Microsoft Office or Windows or iOS. We see updates for these things come out all the time, right? Some of these might also be procedural vulnerabilities, right? So are you not keeping track of the people who are entering and exiting your data center? Or do you not, are you only allowing an individual to go into your data center one at a time without being accompanied by somebody else? And are they prohibited from, taking pictures in that data center? So those are mostly procedural vulnerabilities that you can think of as well. Some of these are also input validation. We mostly see this in SQL queries that can then be injected into the database through text fields on websites. If these are built in a parameterized type of function or form, then it might allow someone to do some replacement and inject even more SQL into that, like subqueries, or allow somebody to just say, select star from employees, and then now I have personally identifiable information from everybody. Or worse, I could drop a table. And you can go Google Little Bobby Tables, the XKCD comic, which is one of my favorite, and you'll get some humor in that as well. Unverified uploads, don't build your websites to allow people to upload .exes if all you're doing are accepting images and videos, right? Or only allowing PDFs and docs if that's what you're looking for. Don't allow them to upload zip files that might contain malicious code, right? They should also be checked and verified to make sure that the file formats match. Also doing kind of hash comparison to make sure that they're not corrupted on the way up, or then they have come from the original sender and haven't been subjected to like a man-in-the-middle attack or something of that nature. Another common vulnerability is what's called a cross-site scripting vulnerability, and this has come about mostly because of all the sites that are built now rely on data from other sites, especially if you look at news sites that are aggregating from other sources. They're using web service links back and forth between those sites to pull in data. Some of those, if you click on that link, that JavaScript might be activated in the background to go against a different site, for instance. Other examples are buffer overflows. So we overload storage locations to cause software to crash. That's one possible cause. The other one is to gain administrative access. So sometimes you can craft a buffer overflow to get the task to fail in a way such that it restarts and allows you to restart without potentially having the right permissions to do that. Missing authorization, so making sure that you have escalated privilege or you put checks in place where you need those credentials of the user and they get verified at certain checkpoints, especially if you're going to do something that requires escalated privileges. Be careful about unencrypted data. Browsers are doing a really good job now of actually checking for SSL on just about everything. But also always remember the email is unencrypted unless you're using a specific encrypted email service like Proton Mail or something like that. Otherwise, all email is unencrypted and could potentially get intercepted. A lot of our hard drives are still unencrypted and they probably should be encrypted with key stored safely. So that if the hard drive was stolen or laptop was stolen, then that data can't be accessed. We've talked a lot about password procedures in the past. I'm going to kind of hop over that. And we've talked about the importance of training and getting those procedures right to mitigate the risk of social engineering, phishing attempts, and those types of things that we've mentioned several times in this class already. So some of this is certainly repeat info. We're talking about different threats that are available. We've talked about viruses and worms and the different ones that are available, and denial of service attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. This is a really good report to go out and read to talk about. I'm going to pull the link up here that explains denial of service attacks. So if you're looking for really good information on DOS attacks, this one's a really good explanation that you can read and walk through. We've talked about malware, keylogger, zombie clients. So that's not new. And we've also talked about rootkits as well that hide themselves inside things like Windows registries. Zero-day exploits is something we haven't discussed yet. And in this instance, it's called a zero-day exploit, especially if we take a look at the graph here below, where developers pretty much have 0 days to address the vulnerability. So if we take a look at the graph down here at the bottom, the risk to the organization is much higher because there's a larger time window in which that patch becomes available or is able to be widely deployed. So these are ones where they're critical in nature, and there's a highly likelihood that they could actually be exploited. And these are ones where they're not necessarily discovered by the software vendor, but someone else has discovered the vulnerability and potentially exploited it already. So now you've got to work extra fast in order to produce a patch or some sort of other way to mitigate the risk, which has happened in the past. We've talked about zombies in the past, unaware of being compromised, and we've talked about packet sniffing as well. And you guys have already used Wireshark to see some of that data. There are good controls in place now that don't necessarily allow what are called brute force password attempts. Where the account locks after 3 or 5 incorrect attempts. For those that are not, you can use programs such as Rainbow Crack, where if you know what the password parameters are, you can program it to come up with all those different permutations, and then set up an automated program to keep guessing passwords for someone's account until they get in. So it's definitely good control to put in place to only allow so many attempts before locking the account. And we've talked about social engineering. One of the newer ones that are out are what are called advanced persistent threats. This is typically customized for an organization or an individual. And this isn't one that's necessarily being automated. So attacker is crafting attacks for a specific individual or a specific organization. They're using a full range of invasions or intrusions, if you will, to try to break in. When we look at controls, we think about physical controls, blocks, background checks, non-technical methods, also thinking about procedures, such as the same person who writes the check can't be the person who changes the address to keep them from sending checks themselves. So you see double entry or dual control measures in place. When we think about technical controls, those are when we're thinking about automatic updates, firewalls, passwords themselves, etc. So I always kind of think about physical, procedural, technical controls and how those get categorized. So hopefully this has provided you a good background of information security models, the differences between traditional and information security or physical assets, some common vulnerabilities and threats to pay attention to, and popular ways of trying to mitigate the risk of those.